And welcome back. We are going to take a quick segue into talking about layers. Now, I did briefly mention layers in a previous video. However, I want to take some time to go over them a little bit more in depth and how they can be used to enrich your artwork. Layers are a thing that, if you aren't familiar with working with them, of course, can be something that is potentially very overwhelming, but they are really very simple once you get to know how to use them, and it's very hard to go back to working without layers. So here I've created a quick image to kind of just demonstrate on, and over here is our layer. Now you'll see we have right now just one layer, layer 1. And if I go down here to the bottom of my screen, you'll see something that looks like a plus icon. That's simply just to create a new layer. And if you hover over it, you'll see, of course, the help icon, help text that says create new layer. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer. Now I have layer 2. Let's just go over to our pencil tool here. So we have pencil tool selected. I'm going to choose a random color here. Let's just go with this green. I'm going to make it nice and dark so it shows up really well. And I'm just going to scribble on this just to show up. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, if I was in something like paint, for example, this image would now be potentially transformed permanently into having these scribbles on it. I'd have to go through either Control-Z to undo it, which of course could take it back, or if I had done this and then maybe I had done something else, I would not have that ability to simply come through and redo it like that. However, in Photoshop, because I can use layers, there's a lot of powerful things they can do. So for example, if I'm here in layer 2 and I just click this little eyeball icon here, which just means simply to hide that layer, you can see that that scribble that I just made has not affected the original image. And this is one of the most powerful things about layers. It allows us to stack different things into a composite that aren't going to necessarily affect the end product until, of course, we are ready to do so. I'm going to go ahead and make that layer visible again, and let's just go ahead and make another layer. And I'm going to choose a different color for my scribble this time. How about we something a little bit more oranges here. And I'm just going to go add another scribble in. And again, similar as before, if I toggle that layer, you can see that it does not affect the other layers. If I toggle layer 2 again, you can see that it does not affect layer 3. So not only doesn't it affect the layers above it, it also doesn't affect the layers above it. So above and below are both safe from the manipulation here. Now, there are, of course, other cool things that we can do with layers. First thing I want to show you is if I go back to my first layer here, which actually has the character image on, I'm just going to hide those two scribble layers for a moment. And if I hit Control-J on my keyboard, or I can right click, and I have a bunch of different options here, but the most common way to do this is simply just to Control-J. And I have a copy of that layer. Now, why would I want a copy of that layer? Well, when we get into doing things like sprite sheets and animations, a lot of times it's easier just to make a copy of something rather than trying to draw the whole image again. And when we're starting off really small, this is not as big of a deal. But as we get into larger and larger images, being able to duplicate a layer can save us a lot of time. Now, if I grab, for example, my Move tool up here, and I click on this layer, layer 1, I can move him. So now he is a friend there. You can see now I have two copies of what's essentially the same image, but they are unique. Now, one thing that you'll notice is if I try to grab this guy right here, I'm on layer 1 copy. If I try to grab him, it will change it to that layer. So even though I was originally on this layer, layer 1 copy, it switched over automatically to this one because Photoshop recognized, hey, you maybe want to grab this object. Now I can do the same thing here with this guy. Notice I'm on layer 1, not layer 1 copy. If I click on him, it switches automatically to that layer. Now if you ever want to keep a layer from being moved, so let's say I do not want to move this sprite right here from his position, I can come up here to the lock icon, click on that, and it will lock that layer. So now when I try to click on this guy and move him, you can see it just acts like I'm trying to do a selection. He will not move because his layer is locked. I can come over here and click on the original guy because you notice he does not have the lock icon on his layer. So I'm still able to freely move him around If I want to unlock a layer, all I need to do is I can go to that layer, click on the lock icon, or I can click up here. Both of those will allow me to do the same thing, so now I'm free to move this guy. Now, last thing I want to show you here, before we get into some cool effects, is a little bit of organization. Now, I turned the scribbles back on for a moment because let's say I want to say, I want to keep all my scribbles in the same thing. You see this sometimes with like text, or maybe you're doing certain pieces of image. You want to group things together. Right now, we don't have very many layers. We only have like 4 layers. But let's say you had 20 layers in your image. That can be a lot of information to try and shift through. So there's a couple things that we want to do first. Number one, I want to name my layers. Yeah, having like layer 1 copy, layer 2, layer 3, those are unique names, but it doesn't tell me what they are. So if I, for example, want to know what layer 2 is, if I toggle that hide icon, oh, that's my green line. So I'm going to just double click that, and I'm going to rename that to green scribble. And if I go to layer 3, well, that should be my orange scribble. Orange scribble. All right. And now these two are renamed. And if I have my 2 people here, I can maybe double click and rename this to first man. And I can rename this guy to second man. Of course, you can name these, whatever you want. The name is not as important so much as, that they are unique, so that way I can keep track of them. So for example, if I was making a sprite and I wanted to have different segments of the body, so for example, the head, the arms, the legs, this is a good way to segment those things so it's easier to come back and edit them later. Now, as I said, there's a little organization that goes into this. I'm going to hold down the Shift key here to select both of these. If you hold down Control, it'll do the same thing. The difference is that Shift allows you to select more than one item, but they all are in a row. If you hold down Control, it allows you to select more than one item, but they do not have to be in sequential layers like this. But we are just going to go ahead and hold down that key, either Control or Shift for this case. Now you can see I have both scribbles selected. And what I want to do is put those into a group. Now if you right click here, you can see you have group from layers, or I can come right down here to the bottom of the screen and you see what looks like a little folder icon, and it says create a new group. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And now you can see it's called Group 1. If I do the same thing with the 2 men that I created earlier, and I click on Create New Group, you can see it's now Group 2. Notice that none of my images have been affected. In fact, if I open up these groups, you can see that my individual layers still exist. Grouping does nothing to affect the layers. It is simply just an organizational technique. All right, now, one thing that we do want to do, as we did it with our scribbles and with our men, is that we had renamed them. We can do the same thing with the groups. So if I double click on Group 1, for example, the text right there, I can rename this to Scribble Group. Or if I come down here to Group 2, I can also right click and you can see here's my different options. You notice there is no rename option here. We cannot rename the group from here. So the only way to do that is to double click, and I'm going to call this group, call this the man group or the sprite group. Doesn't again matter what you call them. So I have those now grouped. Now there is something else we can do with our layers. And this is something that's a little bit more advanced, but is something that might come in handy later down the road. What I want to show you right here is this little drop down here that says normal. Now I've selected the second man, and I'm going to go ahead and just hide the scribble group here. I'm going to collapse that, hit the icons just so the scribbles are out of the way so we can see this a little bit more clearly. On the second man layer, I'm going to go up here and I can hover over each of these different effects. Now you can see there's a bunch of different ones, and you can see some of it's already trying to render here as we go through. Let's just go ahead and change him to an overlay. Now if I do an overlay, you don't see him here because of how this layer is set up. But if I go to something a little different, such as difference, you can see that he is a totally different effect on him now. If I go to, for example, luminosity, you can see that he is now black and white. So for example, if I wanted to have a color image and a black and white image, this is a real quick way to do this. I have a luminosity right here that is set low, and here I have the color. So this is a good way to get grayscale, color. Now, what about opacity? Opacity is this last toggle right here that we're going to look at. Opacity is simply how transparent something is. So if I go to that first man again, for example, just so we can see it a little differently, and I click this opacity, you can see that there's a slider that comes up. If I drag that slider to the left here, you can see that he disappears. If I put it somewhere in the middle, you'll see he starts to become more and more visible. If I drag it to the left, he becomes transparent. Drag it to the right, he's pretty solid. Let's just, for this exercise right now, go ahead and set him to about 75% opacity. And you can see that he is now 75% transparent. All right, and that is going to wrap up some of the stuff that you need to know for layers. Again, this is some very basic techniques that's going to make your ability to create sprites and other pixel art a lot easier.